A routine flight, a missing pilot, a voice on the intercom that no one expected. When a flight attendant discovers a hidden case, she realizes this plane was never meant to land safely. Who's really in control? What's inside the case? And why was no one on this flight supposed to survive? Buckle up, this is a ride you won't forget. Samira Cole had never been one to complain. That wasn't how she was raised. Growing up in Brooklyn, she had learned early on that the world wasn't always fair, especially for a black woman trying to make her way in a world that often refused to see her. She had worked for Horizon Air for 15 years, long enough to know every in-flight protocol like the back of her hand. But experience didn't always mean respect. As she stood in the break room at JFK Airport, adjusting her navy blue blazer in the bathroom mirror, she overheard two younger flight attendants, both new hires, both white, giggling about their recent promotions. One of them, Olivia, barely in her mid-20s, had just been named lead flight attendant for the Paris to New York route. Samira exhaled slowly, forcing herself to smile. It was nothing new. She had more experience than half the flight crew combined, yet she had never been given the opportunity to lead. Management always had an excuse. Seniority didn't guarantee a leadership role. The company was restructuring. Or, her least favorite, we're looking for fresh energy. Fresh energy. Right. She turned away from the mirror, fixing the silver wings pinned to her uniform, and headed out to the pre-flight meeting. The usual suspects were there. Kara Sullivan, the senior flight lead, already looking exasperated. Olivia, beaming with pride over her new position, and a handful of other attendants who barely acknowledged Samira as she walked in. Kara cleared her throat. All right, team. Flight 417, Paris to JFK. Pretty straightforward. Full flight, but no major VIPs. She scrolled through her tablet and frowned slightly. Well, except one. Some businessman in first class. Raymond DeLuca. Corporate connections. Other than that, business as usual. Business as usual. Samira kept her face neutral, but something about that name, DeLuca, itched at the back of her mind. She had heard it before, though she couldn't place where. Angela, another flight attendant, and one of the few people Samira actually trusted, nudged her gently. Hey, did you hear the rumor? She whispered. Samira glanced at her. What rumor? Angela hesitated before replying, keeping her voice low. Security caught someone trying to smuggle cargo onto one of our flights last week. They covered it up, but some of the ground crew said it was something dangerous. Samira arched an eyebrow. And? Angela sighed. And that same security team is working our flight today. Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? Before Samira could respond, Kara clapped her hands together, signaling the end of the meeting. All right, everyone. Wheels up in an hour. Let's make it a smooth one. The crew dispersed, and as they made their way to the gate, Samira couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just another long-haul flight. Maybe she was overthinking things. Or maybe she wasn't. Samira had worked enough transatlantic flights to know when something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing she could point to and say, that's it, but it was there, creeping under her skin like the hum of turbulence before it hit. The boarding process for Flight 417 started like any other. Passengers trickled in, some wide-eyed and eager, others already exhausted before even reaching their seats. Businessmen clutched leather briefcases, parents wrangled fidgety toddlers, and an older couple paused near the entrance, struggling with their overhead bags. Let me help you with that, sir, Samira offered, stepping in smoothly. The man, probably in his 70s, looked up at her with kind but tired eyes. Oh, bless you. They don't make these bins the way they used to. She smiled, tucking his carry-on away effortlessly. That's what I'm here for. Not just a pretty face, huh? He chuckled, his wife playfully nudging him in the ribs. Samira laughed politely, though her attention flickered toward the first-class cabin. There, seated in 1A, was Raymond DeLuca, the so-called VIP Kara had mentioned. He was the kind of man who looked important without trying. Crisp suit, slick-back silver hair, the slight smirk of someone used to getting his way. He was reading something on his phone, his expression completely neutral, but when Samira passed by, his gaze flicked up, just for a second. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her stomach tighten. A memory stirred, half-formed. DeLuca? DeLuca! Why do I know that name? But before she could place it, Kara's voice crackled through her earpiece. Samira, check the rear galley. One of the ground crew left something behind. Samira exhaled, pushing the thought aside. On it. She made her way to the back of the aircraft, weaving through the last stragglers still getting settled. As she stepped into the galley, she immediately spotted the object in question. An unmarked gray metal case sitting on the floor near the emergency exit. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't unusual for ground crew to forget things. But this didn't look like misplaced equipment. It looked deliberate. She crouched, hesitating for only a moment before brushing her fingers over the handle. The case was heavy, too heavy for something innocent. A voice startled her. That's not yours to touch. She snapped her head up. A man stood in the galley entrance, half shrouded by the dim overhead lighting. He wore a Horizon Air maintenance uniform. Same colors, same logo. But something about him was wrong. He wasn't carrying any tools. His name tag was blank, and he was watching her too closely. Samira straightened slowly, keeping her voice even. You with ground crew? The man tilted his head, studying her like she was an equation he hadn't solved yet. Just doing my job, he said, smooth as silk. Then with deliberate ease, he bent down, grabbed the case, and hoisted it onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing. Enjoy your flight, ma'am, he said with a half smile before turning and disappearing into the restricted access door. Samira stood frozen. The door led to the underbelly of the plane. Cargo holds, mechanical compartments, places flight attendants had no business being. And yet, he had walked through like he belonged, like he had a right to be there. The uneasy feeling in her gut twisted tighter. This was not just another flight, and she had the sinking feeling she wasn't the only one who knew it. Samira had learned to trust her instincts. In this job, gut feelings could mean the difference between routine turbulence and an emergency landing. And right now, every nerve in her body told her something wasn't right. As she walked back toward the main cabin, her mind replayed the scene in the rear galley. The unmarked case, the man with no name tag, the way he had watched her like he was sizing her up. He wasn't ground crew. She was sure of it. But before she could even think about reporting it, Kara's voice came through her earpiece again, this time sharper. Samira, we need you up front. Now. She glanced at the passengers still boarding, just a few left trickling in, then turned on her heel and made her way to first class. As she approached the front galley, she saw Kara standing with arms crossed, Olivia beside her looking tense, and in the middle of them was Diego Navarro. Or at least that's what his ticket said. He was tall, tan skin, dark hair cropped short, dressed in a well-fitted charcoal suit. Everything about him screamed businessman. Expensive watch, polished demeanor, the kind of confidence that came naturally to men used to control. But there was something else too, a sharpness behind his gaze, a readiness. Not just a businessman, a man trained to watch, to react. Sir, Kara was saying, voice clipped, your boarding pass is flagged for additional security clearance. We need to verify some details before takeoff. Diego didn't blink. I already cleared security at Charles de Gaulle. Is there a problem? Just a routine check, Kara said, but her stance said otherwise. Olivia fidgeted beside her, looking at Samira like she was waiting for backup. Samira folded her arms. Sir, can I see some identification? Diego exhaled, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He opened it just enough for them to see. A New York driver's license, a company ID badge for some generic finance firm. Something was off. The way he held the wallet, the slight tilt, he wasn't showing them everything. Kara took a step back, satisfied. All right, looks good. Enjoy your flight. Diego gave a polite nod, slipping his wallet away before moving toward his seat. But as he passed Samira, his voice dropped just enough for only her to hear. Keep your eyes open. Then he was gone, sliding into 2B like nothing had happened. Samira stood still, her heart hammering. First, the mystery man in the galley. Now a passenger with a warning? She had no idea what was happening on this flight, but she was damn sure she was about to find out. The final boarding call had been made. The jet bridge retracted. The heavy hum of the aircraft vibrated beneath Samira's feet as the cabin crew prepared for takeoff. She went through the motions, checking seat belts, securing tray tables, making sure every passenger was settled. But her mind was elsewhere. Something was wrong with this flight. She could feel it. As she reached first class, she noticed Diego watching her. His expression was unreadable, but the message in his eyes was clear. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Samira clenched her jaw and kept moving. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff." The captain's voice came over the intercom. Samira buckled herself into her jump seat near the front galley. Across from her, Olivia did the same, offering a tired smile. "Long day already," Olivia muttered. Samira just nodded. The engines roared to life. The plane rolled down the runway, picking up speed. And then, just as the wheels left the ground, a voice crackled through the overhead speakers. But it wasn't the captain. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Flight 417. The voice was smooth, cold. Samira's blood turned to ice. "We have a slight change in our destination," the voice continued, almost amused. She looked at Olivia, saw the color drain from her face. Diego was already unbuckling his seatbelt. Samira's breath hitched. This wasn't just a bad feeling anymore. This was real, and they were trapped in the sky. The cabin fell into an eerie silence. The passengers, who had been settling in for a long transatlantic flight, froze as the unfamiliar voice echoed through the speakers. Samira's breath came short and fast. This wasn't normal. This wasn't part of any in-flight procedure. The voice was calm, too calm. "As of now," it continued, "this aircraft is under new management." A ripple of confusion spread through the passengers. Some glanced around, frowning, while others removed their headphones, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. Samira unbuckled her harness with quick, practiced movements. Across from her, Olivia's hands trembled slightly as she did the same. "What the hell is going on?" Olivia whispered. Samira shook her head. "Stay calm." But inside, her mind was racing. She turned toward the first-class cabin. Diego Navarro was already on his feet. He wasn't looking at her. He was scanning the room, searching for something, or someone. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the intercom cut off. The hum of the engines filled the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. And then chaos. A man in row 7 shot to his feet. "What kind of joke is this?" he demanded. "Where's the damn pilot?" A woman gasped. A baby started crying somewhere in the back. Murmurs turned to nervous chatter. Samira moved quickly. She placed a hand on the overhead bin and raised her voice just enough to carry. "Everyone, please remain seated. We're looking into it." Kara appeared at the front of the cabin, her face pale but composed. She signaled Samira to join her. As soon as Samira stepped into the front galley, Kara whispered, "We lost contact with the cockpit." Samira felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean lost contact?" "I mean the intercom to the flight deck isn't working. The door's locked and the pilots aren't responding." Samira's fingers curled into her palm. "That voice—" "It wasn't them," Kara confirmed. For the first time since stepping on this plane, fear settled deep in Samira's bones. Something was very, very wrong. Samira's first instinct was to rush to the cockpit herself, but she knew better. If someone had taken control of the intercom, it meant one of two things. Either the pilots were being held hostage, or they were already out of the equation. And neither option was good. Kara exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. "I need you to go back and keep the passengers calm. We can't have a panic situation." Samira hesitated. "We need to get into that cockpit." Kara nodded tightly. "Agreed, but until we figure out how, we can't let them know we're scrambling." Samira took one last look toward the locked cockpit door, then turned and stepped back into the main cabin. She met Diego's gaze as she walked past. "Keep your eyes open," he murmured. She didn't have time to ask what he meant. Just as she reached the first row of economy, a loud thud came from the rear of the plane. Heads turned, passengers stiffened. Another thud, louder this time. Then the voice returned. "I'm going to need everyone to sit down." The lights flickered. Samira's pulse skyrocketed. Passengers gasped, their confusion shifting into something sharper. Fear. Whoever had taken over the intercom wasn't just playing games. This was a warning, and she had a feeling the next one wouldn't be so subtle. The flickering lights cast uneasy shadows across the cabin. Passengers whispered among themselves, heads twisting in every direction, searching for an explanation. Some reached for their call buttons, others clutched the armrests of their seats, waiting for a flight attendant to tell them everything was fine. But everything was not fine. Samira took a slow, steady breath, schooling her expression into something calm, even if her heart was pounding like a war drum. She had been trained for emergencies, engine failures, medical crises, unruly passengers. But this was something else. The intercom crackled again, the same controlled voice filtering through the cabin. "There is no need to panic. Yet." Samira clenched her jaw. Passengers were shifting uncomfortably now, their unease morphing into something closer to fear. In the back of the plane, a man in a business suit stood up, his voice sharp. "Who the hell is this? Where are the pilots?" Silence. Then, a loud metallic click, not from the speakers, from the rear galley. A deep, sinking feeling settled in Samira's gut. She turned, her eyes darting toward the aisle, searching, looking, and then she saw him, the man from earlier, the one with the fake maintenance uniform. He was standing near the emergency exit, his arms crossed, watching her. Only this time, he wasn't alone. 3 other men had positioned themselves throughout the plane, one in first class, one near the center, and another standing near the lavatory. Passengers hadn't noticed them yet, too preoccupied with the voice over the intercom. But Samira knew. This is it. It wasn't just a bad feeling anymore. This flight had been hijacked. The cabin felt smaller than it had minutes ago, the air heavier, charged with something unseen but unmistakable. Fear. Samira could hear it in the way passengers whispered, in the sharp intakes of breath when someone shifted too quickly in their seat. They didn't know what was happening yet, but they knew enough, and so did she. Samira stole a glance toward the man near the emergency exit, the one she'd seen before takeoff with the unmarked case. He hadn't moved since the intercom announcement. Unlike the rest of the passengers, he wasn't reacting with confusion or fear. He was just waiting. That meant he already knew what was coming. A cold chill crawled up Samira's spine. A flight attendant's job was to handle turbulence, medical emergencies, even difficult passengers. But no amount of training had prepared her for this. Then, movement. The man near the exit tapped his wrist, the tiniest gesture, but it sent a clear message. It was starting. Before Samira could react, one of the first-class passengers stood, a businessman in a gray suit, maybe mid-40s, his brows furrowed in frustration. "All right, enough of this," he barked. "What kind of sick joke is this? Where's the damn captain?" Samira's stomach clenched. "Sit down. Please, sit down." The air shifted again, only this time it was different. Not fear, control. From the back of the plane, a man stood up. Not a passenger. One of them. He was tall, built like someone who didn't just work out, someone who trained. His presence alone was enough to silence the murmuring around him. He adjusted his jacket, then took a step forward. Passengers turned toward him, their confusion morphing into something sharper. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't have to. The way he walked down the aisle, slow, deliberate, was enough to send a clear message. Stay seated. Don't interfere. The businessman in the gray suit, the one who had spoken up, hesitated. It was just a fraction of a second, but that was all it took. The man in the jacket lunged. Before anyone could process what was happening, the businessman was slammed back into his seat, his head snapping against the window with a dull thud. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Someone let out a choked sob, and then, from the overhead speakers, the voice returned. "We gave you a warning," it said, calm as ever. "That was your first mistake." Samira's pulse skyrocketed. Passengers shrank into their seats. Some turned their faces away, hoping that if they didn't look, they wouldn't be next. The man in the jacket didn't even glance at the businessman he had just taken down. He turned and made his way toward the front of the cabin. Toward her. Samira forced herself to stay still. This was the moment. If she panicked, if she made the wrong move, things would spiral fast. But before she could decide what to do, Diego Navarro, still seated, still watching, spoke. Subtle, he said dryly. The man in the jacket stopped. For the first time, he looked at Diego. And just like that, the balance of the cabin shifted again. Samira didn't know how, but she knew one thing. Diego had just made himself a target. The moment Diego spoke, the tension in the cabin tightened like a noose. The hijacker, the one who had just taken down the businessman without hesitation, turned fully toward him, his movements precise, almost too controlled. There was something in his stance, in the way he held himself, that made Samira's stomach twist. This wasn't just some low-level thug. This was someone trained. Diego didn't flinch. He just leaned back slightly in his seat, arms resting loosely on the armrests, as if he wasn't sitting in the middle of a hijacking. His expression was unreadable, but Samira caught the flicker of calculation in his eyes. The hijacker studied him for a beat. Then slowly, he smirked. "Funny guy," he muttered. His voice was rough, with an accent Samira couldn't quite place. "You think this is a joke?" Diego shrugged, casual. "I think you just made a big mistake." The hijacker's smirk faltered, and then, before anyone could process what was happening, Diego moved. In one sharp motion, he yanked the tray table from the seat in front of him and drove it upward, hard. It caught the hijacker right in the stomach. The man let out a grunt, doubling over slightly, and in that split second, Diego was up. The cabin erupted. Passengers gasped, some scrambling to move away, others too frozen with shock to react. Samira's breath hitched. Diego wasn't just fighting back, he was fast. Too fast for an ordinary businessman. He grabbed the hijacker's wrist before he could recover, twisting it sharply. A sharp pop echoed through the space as the man let out a snarl of pain. But Diego had made one miscalculation. There were more of them. From the rear of the plane, the fake maintenance worker, the one Samira had seen with the case before takeoff, moved. She barely had time to register it before the dull click of a gun being cocked filled the cabin. "Enough!" Everything stopped. Diego froze, his grip still tight around the first hijacker's wrist. The new hijacker, the one now holding the gun, took slow, measured steps forward. He didn't raise the weapon. He didn't have to. "You're quick," he said, his tone flat. "But you're not that quick." Samira could see Diego's jaw clench. For a split second, she thought he might push his luck. Then slowly, he released his grip and raised his hands in mock surrender. The first hijacker straightened with a curse, rolling his injured wrist. He shot Diego a murderous glare, but didn't retaliate. Because the power had shifted again. Because now, there was a gun. And whoever was really in charge of this hijacking had just decided to make their presence known. The hijacker with the gun didn't rush. He walked slowly, deliberately, taking in the scene as if he was bored. "Not bad," he mused, tilting his head slightly as he regarded Diego. "Not exactly what we expected, but interesting." Diego stayed quiet. Samira could barely breathe. Passengers cowered in their seats, some with hands raised instinctively, others gripping their armrests or so tightly their knuckles turned white. The hijacker stopped just a few feet from Diego and exhaled, as if disappointed. "You had your chance," he murmured. "Shame." Then he raised the gun and fired. The gunshot exploded through the cabin. People screamed. Samira flinched, her ears ringing. But Diego was still standing. The bullet had missed, not by accident. The hijacker had aimed for the overhead panel instead, shattering the plastic, sending debris raining down. A warning shot, a demonstration. Samira's stomach twisted. The hijacker lowered the gun slightly, letting the silence drag before speaking again. "Let's get something straight," he said, his voice eerily calm. "This is not a negotiation. This is not a rescue mission. This is ours now." No one spoke. No one moved. And then, the intercom crackled, and a new voice filled the cabin, a voice that sent ice down Samira's spine. "Enough playing around," the voice drawled. "Not one of the hijackers in the cabin, not the man with the gun." This voice was coming from the cockpit. The real one in charge had just entered the game. The voice over the intercom was smooth, calculated, too steady to belong to someone who had just seized control of a plane in midair. It wasn't the same as the others. No aggression, no theatrics, just quiet certainty. Samira felt her stomach tighten. Whoever was speaking wasn't just a hijacker. He was the one running this. The man with the gun straightened slightly, glancing toward the cockpit door, as if awaiting further instructions. Then the voice spoke again. "We're done with the warm-up," it said. "Now, let's get to the real reason we're here." Samira's skin prickled. Passengers exchanged frightened glances. Some clung to each other. Others squeezed their eyes shut, as if willing themselves to wake up from a nightmare. The man in charge let the silence linger before continuing. "There's something on this plane. Something that doesn't belong here." A pause. "And we're going to find it." Samira's heart skipped. She knew. The case. The unmarked case from the galley. The one she had seen before takeoff. Her gaze flicked toward the fake maintenance worker. The one who had carried it onto the flight. He was standing near the emergency exit, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He hadn't moved. Hadn't spoken. And now she understood why. Because he wasn't just a hijacker. He was the reason for the hijacking. Samira could feel her pulse hammering as realization settled in. They weren't after money. They weren't after hostages. They were after something on this plane. And whatever it was dangerous enough to justify hijacking a transatlantic flight. The man on the intercom continued. "You have two choices," he said, almost conversational. "Hand it over willingly." A pause, or we tear this plane apart until we find it. The gunman in the cabin didn't speak. He didn't have to. The message was clear. Cooperate, or things would get worse. Samira's breath came shallow. She needed to move, to think. She wasn't the only one. In the seat beside her, Diego's fingers twitched slightly, just enough for her to notice. A signal. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew one thing. He wasn't done fighting, and neither was she. Because if they handed over that case, there was no telling what would happen next. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick and suffocating. The passengers barely breathed, their eyes darting between the hijackers and the flight attendants, searching for answers that weren't coming. Samira's mind raced. They wanted the case. That meant whatever was inside was more valuable than an entire plane full of hostages. And if that was true, there was no way they were letting anyone walk away from this alive. She looked toward Diego. He was still seated, his face unreadable, but his fingers tapped against his knee again. That same rhythmic pattern. A message. A countdown. He was about to do something. Samira swallowed hard, then turned her attention back to the hijacker with the gun. "You think someone here has it?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "A passenger?" The gunman didn't react. He just stared. The intercom crackled again. "I think," the voice drawled, "that people like you always know more than you let on." Samira's pulse spiked. He was talking about her. The man in the cockpit, whoever he was, had been watching. He had seen her move through the cabin, seen her watching. He knew she had noticed the case. Diego shifted slightly in his seat. His fingers stopped tapping. That was the warning. Then he moved. Diego was fast, faster than Samira thought possible. In one motion, he lunged from his seat and slammed into the hijacker closest to him, sending the man sprawling into the aisle. Passengers screamed. The gunman turned, raising his weapon. But Diego was already moving. He grabbed the tray table from the nearest seat and snapped it upward, hard. It cracked against the hijacker's wrist, knocking the gun loose. The weapon skidded across the floor. For a second, Samira thought he might win. Then, a second hijacker stepped forward and fired. The shot rang through the cabin. Samira flinched as a spray of sparks erupted from the overhead panel. The bullet had missed. On purpose. A warning. A reminder that they were in control. Diego froze. The first hijacker scrambled back to his feet, grabbing Diego by the collar and shoving him hard against the nearest seat. Blood trickled from Diego's lip, but he didn't fight back. Not now. Not yet. The gunman bent down, retrieving his weapon. He straightened slowly, his gaze locked onto Diego's. "You really want to test us?" he asked, voice cold. Diego said nothing. The gunman exhaled, then turned toward the cockpit door. "Enough playing around," he said. The intercom crackled, and the voice from the cockpit spoke again. "Agreed?" Then in a tone almost amused. Bring the flight attendant. Samira's blood ran cold. They meant her. The moment the words left the intercom, Samira felt the shift. The gunman turned toward her, his expression impassive, like he'd already made up his mind. "This one," he muttered as if confirming. The voice from the cockpit responded smoothly. "She's observant, she's smart, and she's been watching since before takeoff." A pause. "Bring her." Samira's stomach turned to ice. She had spent her entire career handling tense situations, de-escalating conflicts before they turned into something worse. But this wasn't a conflict. This was a hunt. The gunman gestured with his weapon. "Move." She didn't hesitate. Not because she wasn't afraid, she was terrified, but because she knew fear wouldn't help her now. As she stepped forward, Kara shot her a look, her lips parting slightly. Protest, disbelief, panic. But she didn't say anything, because she knew there was nothing she could do. The passengers shrank back as Samira passed, their gazes flickering between her and the hijackers, their faces full of helplessness. She felt it too, but she forced herself to keep walking. When she reached the cockpit door, the gunman tapped twice. A soft click. The lock released. The door swung open, and she stepped inside. The first thing Samira noticed was the quiet. The cockpit was still. No frantic radio chatter, no urgent movements. Just dim screens glowing in the dark, casting eerie green and blue light across the instrument panels. And then, the man in the pilot's seat turned. He wasn't what she expected. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. Silver hair combed neatly back. A sharp, tailored suit. Expensive, understated. He didn't look like a hijacker. He looked like a CEO. Like someone used to power. His eyes met hers. And he smiled. "Miss Cole," he said, like they were old colleagues meeting for coffee. "I was wondering when we'd finally speak." Samira clenched her jaw. "You know my name." The man gestured lazily to a small monitor near the flight controls. A live security feed flickered on the screen, an aerial view of the first-class cabin. "I make it a point to know things," he said smoothly. "You, for example, the moment you stepped onto this plane, you started paying attention. That's rare. Most people don't see what's right in front of them." Her hands curled into fists. "Where are the pilots?" she asked. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Unfortunately," he said, "they're no longer with us." Her stomach dropped. Relax," he interrupted. "It was clean. Quick. More than I can say for most endings." Samira inhaled sharply, forcing down the nausea rising in her throat. "He killed them." She glanced at the controls. "Then who's flying this plane?" His smile widened. "I am." Her pulse spiked. "You're not a pilot." He chuckled. "Not officially, no." Her mind whirled. A man with no official flight experience had hijacked a commercial jet and was flying it right now. And he was calm. He wasn't worried, because he already knew exactly how this was going to end. Samira swallowed hard. "Where are you taking us?" The man leaned back in his seat, as if settling in for a conversation he had been waiting to have. "That," he said, "depends entirely on you." She stiffened. He wasn't just flying this plane. He was giving her a choice. And suddenly she realized. She wasn't just a hostage. She was part of the plan. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them. Outside, nothing but the endless stretch of night sky, the plane slicing through it like a ghost. Samira's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "You expect me to believe I have a choice?" The man, the pilot now, smiled like he was indulging a student who had asked the right question. "Of course you do," he said. "I wouldn't have brought you here if you didn't." Samira glanced at the flight controls. "If I could just—" "Don't," he murmured. She snapped her gaze back to him. He wasn't even looking at the controls. He had been watching her. "I know what you're thinking, Miss Cole. The moment I turned my back, you'd grab the yoke, try to wrestle this plane into your control." He leaned forward slightly. "But let me save you the trouble." He pressed a button. A screen flickered to life, an external camera feed showing the underbelly of the plane. Her breath caught. Attached to the fuselage was something she recognized instantly. A bomb. Oh my God. Her fingers curled into her palms. The pilot leaned back. pleased by her reaction. Now you understand why we're talking. She forced herself to breathe. You hijacked an entire plane just to blow it up? His smile didn't waver. Not exactly. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Because if he didn't hijack the plane to crash it, then what the hell did he want? He let the silence stretch before speaking again. There is something on this plane, he said slowly. Something valuable, and it needs to reach the right hands. Samira's mind raced. The case. That's what this is about? She asked. A piece of cargo? The pilot exhaled as if she had disappointed him. Not cargo, Miss Cole. Information, knowledge. The kind of knowledge that reshapes the world. Her stomach twisted. Who are you? She whispered. He tilted his head slightly. A facilitator. That's not an answer. He chuckled. It's the only one you're getting. She swallowed. And if I refuse to help you? His expression remained pleasant. Then this plane won't reach its destination. Her pulse spiked. She had been right. They weren't supposed to survive. She licked her lips, trying to buy herself time. You need me for something, she said carefully. You wouldn't be talking to me if you didn't. Smart girl. She clenched her fists. What do you want? The pilot's smile returned, slow and deliberate. I want you, he said, to make sure that case stays out of the wrong hands. She stared at him. Whose hands? His eyes darkened. The people waiting for us in New York. A chill crawled up her spine. New York, the flight's original destination, which meant they weren't rerouting. They were going exactly where they were always meant to go. But the difference now? Only he knew what was waiting for them on the ground. And if he was telling the truth, then whoever had been expecting this plane to land wasn't rescuing anyone. They were finishing the job. Samira's pulse thundered in her ears. She had been trying to piece it together since the moment the plane was taken, trying to understand why. But now she knew. This was never about ransom, never about a political statement. This was about making sure something arrived. Or making sure something didn't. The pilot watched her carefully, gauging her reaction. You understand now, don't you? Samira swallowed. You're saying the real threat isn't you. It's who's waiting for us? His lips twitched in amusement. I knew you were sharp, she clenched her jaw. Then why the theatrics? Why hijack the plane instead of just... Because, he interrupted smoothly, the people expecting this flight are expecting compliance. They are expecting their package, neat and undisturbed. He gestured vaguely toward the cargo hold. But what they are not expecting is interference. Samira exhaled sharply. You don't want them to get the case. Not as planned, he admitted, which is where you come in. She narrowed her eyes. You still haven't told me what's inside it. His smile faded. And I won't. She clenched her fists. Then why involve me? He tilted his head slightly, as if she had just asked something interesting. Because, Miss Cole, you're the only one who can walk through that airport and no one will question why you have it. A chill ran through her. The pieces snapped together so fast it nearly made her dizzy. The hijackers weren't trying to steal the case. They were trying to change who delivered it. And somehow she had just become the final link in their plan. Samira took a slow, deep breath. Let me get this straight, she said, keeping her voice measured. You hijacked a commercial flight, killed the pilots, threatened hundreds of passengers, and now you're asking for my help? The pilot chuckled, shaking his head. I'm not asking. Her blood turned to ice. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. You don't have a choice, Miss Cole. You'll walk off this plane with the case in hand. You'll get through security, untouched, unquestioned. And then, his eyes glinted. You'll decide what happens next. Samira's stomach twisted. And if I say no? The pilot exhaled slowly, then gestured toward the monitor displaying the bomb on the plane's underbelly. You already know the answer to that. Her breath caught. This wasn't just about her anymore. If she refused, they wouldn't just let the plane land. They'd make sure it never did. She clenched her jaw. You're asking me to trust you. The pilot's lips curved slightly. I'm asking you to trust yourself. Samira's pulse pounded. This was it, the moment that changed everything. And somehow she had just become the one holding everyone's fate in her hands. Samira's mind was racing. She was out of options. The man in the cockpit had planned for everything, except her. She could do as he said. Take the case, walk off the plane like nothing had happened, hand it over, and hope she wasn't giving the wrong people exactly what they wanted, or she could gamble. She could take the case and run. But where? Would security stop her? Would the people waiting for this plane hunt her down? There was no winning move, only survival. The pilot watched her, waiting. He didn't need to rush her decision. The plane was still flying. But soon it wouldn't be. One way or another, they were landing. And what happened after that was up to her. The runway lights of JFK burned bright below as the plane made its final approach. The passengers, still unaware of the full story, sat in terrified silence, gripping their seats, waiting for the nightmare to end. Samira sat with the case in her lap. The pilot had handed it to her without another word. No more threats, no more instructions. Because he didn't need to. She knew what was at stake. As the wheels touched down, she took a deep breath. She had made her choice. And now there was no turning back. The plane taxied to a stop. The cabin doors unlocked. The FBI was already waiting. And as Samira stepped onto the jet bridge, case in hand, she realized this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about choices. Samira was never supposed to be the hero of this flight, but in the face of impossible odds, she made the only decision she could. Now the question is, what would you have done in her place? Would you trust the enemy or risk everything for the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that keep you questioning what you do when the stakes are life or death. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and trust no one at 30,000 feet.